Good morning. Well, the last two videos went longer than I intended, but we got through it together. So today we're going to talk about how we got the Bible, how we got from the original autographs of the New Testament. I'm going to talk mostly about the New Testament today, not the Old Testament, because the New Testament's more relevant to what I'm going to be talking about in this series. So I'm going to talk about how we got from the original writings to our modern translations and stuff. And so let me start with the claim that I mentioned 2 videos ago about how there's this idea that the Bible that we have today is based on copies of copies of copies. And it's kind of like the telephone game. You know, you give a message to one person, and then when they give it to somebody else, they make a mistake, and that mistake gets carried forward. And so the next person adds another mistake to it. And after so many iterations, you know, it's almost unrecognizable. Well, the Bible is not like that, because the telephone game is just a single line of transmission. Whereas in the case of the Bible, you'll have like one manuscript, and maybe 5 copies or more will be made from that one manuscript, and then 5 copies from each of those, and etc. It gets huge. And so like, imagine if you had like a 1-page document, and you gave it to a classroom of 30 people or something like that, and you had them all hand copied it. And imagine that every single one of them made at least one mistake. And so you would have 30 textual variants in this one document. Well, the fact that you have 30 textual variants is not going to prevent you from reconstructing what the original said, because they're probably not all going to make exactly the same mistake. So if you compared these 30 copies side by side, it would be very easy to figure out what the original wording was in the whole thing. And if you think about it, the more copies that there are, the more mistakes you're going to have. So like, if I say I made 1 copy of the document, and let's say I made 3 mistakes. So I've got 1 copy, 3 mistakes. Now imagine I do 5 copies and do 1 mistake each. Well, now I've got 5 mistakes with 5 copies as opposed to 3 mistakes in the 1 copy. Well, you might be tempted to think that, well, the more mistakes I have, the harder it's going to be to reconstruct the original. But just the opposite is the case. If I've only got 1 copy and there's 3 mistakes, there's no way for me to get back to the original. But if I've got 5 copies with 5 mistakes, it would be very easy for me to get back to the original. So there are, I think the number I heard one time was something like 400,000 textual variants in all of our manuscript evidence for the New Testament. And that sounds forbidding, because I don't think there's 400,000 words in the New Testament. But the reason for that is because there are so many copies. From the 2nd century to, I think, the printing press, there's something like 5,800 copies of the New Testament. A lot of those copies are fragments. They're not whole copies of the New Testament. The earliest fragment we have is P56, I think. And that's a little fraction of a fragment of John's Gospel, and it dates anywhere from 100 to 150. One number I hear a lot is 120. The first complete New Testament that we have is Codex Sinaiticus, I think. You can Google this. Codex Sinaiticus, and it dates to around 350. That's the first complete New Testament. Before that, we have complete copies of individual books, and I did a little Googling a while ago, and I never did find out what's the first complete book of the New Testament, but I did find that I think P46 is the first complete copy of all of Paul's letters, or most of Paul's letters. And that one dates to around, I think they said, between 175 and 225, so around 200, so around there. So between I guess around 120 up until around 200, I guess, most of what we have there are fragments. Some fragments are big, some are small, but anyway, so the manuscript evidence we have for the New Testament is really good. If you compare it to other ancient documents and stuff, we have more copies that date closer to the originals than anything else in antiquity at all, by a long shot. And so there are certain techniques that textual critics can use to get back to the original. First of all, most of these textual variants that we have are differences in spelling. I mean, that takes care of the vast majority of them. But there are certain kinds of mistakes that are easily recognizable. For example, if you've ever tried to copy a document or anything like that, sometimes you'll come to a word at the end of a line, and you'll remember that word and you'll write it down, and you'll go back and look and you'll find that word again so that you can go to the next line. Well, if you're in a situation where you've got a line up here that ends at a certain word and a line down here that ends in that same word, you might, when you go back, look at the wrong word. And so one of two things could happen. You can either leave out everything between those two words and leave that out in your copy, or you might accidentally copy the same line twice because you looked at the same word twice. Mistakes like that are easily recognizable. Some of them are just the fact that a lot of words look very similar. Like an O can look like a G, that kind of thing in the English language, or O and a Q can look the same. So you can get stuff like that, and just changing one little letter can completely change a word. But some of the techniques involve looking at older manuscripts and favoring those over newer manuscripts. Another one is looking at the majority readings over the minority readings. And so there are all kinds of techniques. It's very technical. If you want to read a really technical explanation of textual criticism, Bruce Metzger has a book called The Text of the New Testament, and I think Bart Ehrman did an updated version of it. I read Bruce Metzger's version before Bart Ehrman's, but if you want to read like a really simplified version that's made for non-experts, James White has this book called The King James Only Controversy. And what he was attempting to do there is he was attempting to address people who think that the King James Version is the only legitimate translation. But he talks a lot about textual criticism in that book, and he just makes it really easy to understand. So if you want to just get your foot in the door, I highly recommend that book. So basically, when I was taking L. Michael White's class at UT Austin, I remember him saying in class one time that the preservation of the Bible is not really an issue. We're pretty confident about the preservation of the Bible. It's better preserved than anything else in antiquity. I was watching a debate one time between Bart Ehrman and James White, and Bart Ehrman made this argument that we can't get back to the originals because, like, say you've got an original letter of Paul, and then somebody makes a copy of that and it has some mistakes, and somebody makes a copy of that and it has even more mistakes, and somebody makes a copy of that and it has even more mistakes, and finally somebody makes multiple copies from one of these copies. If that's the case, then we can never get back to Paul's original letter. We can only get back to that first copy from which multiple copies were made. And James White's response, well, surely, it's not the case that you would have just done one copy from the original and one copy from that copy. You would have made multiple copies from every one of these stages of development. They never really resolved that issue in the debate, but I obviously side with James White on that one. It seems crazy to me to think that they wouldn't have made multiple copies of the originals. Because everybody wanted one. Why would they especially if they were trying to preserve these things, which they obviously were, they wouldn't have just had it sit there with nobody making copies out of it for a long time. So as long as you've got multiple copies from a single document, you're going to be able to get back to the original. There are really only a handful of unresolved textual variants. When textual critics and scholars and everything look at all these things, they compile what are called critical texts of the New Testament. And there's a few of them. There's the United Bible Society 4th edition, and this is a critical text. And it's the result of all these textual critics coming together and arguing amongst themselves and finally arriving at what they think the original said. But they'll also put in the footnotes all the variant readings. And if you look at a lot of modern translations today, most of those also contain variant readings in the footnotes. So you know that, different manuscripts say different things. And so you can get an idea of the lay of the land just by looking at a modern translation. So you can tell from that we've got we know pretty much what is said, but there are just a handful of unresolved variants that really don't make a big difference. If you're trying to do history, they're not really going to make a difference. There's also the Nestle Island. I think they're up to the 28th edition now, possibly 29th, I'm not sure. It was James White's book, the King James Only Controversy, that got me interested in textual criticism. And I read a lot about it way back then. That was almost 20 years ago. And I've forgotten more than I've learned. So I flipped through his book a while ago just to remind myself of a few things. So yeah, the preservation of the Bible should not be an issue. There's also Westcott and Hort. That's another critical text in the New Testament. So the preservation of the Bible is kind of a non-issue. Well, it is an issue. It's always an issue, but I mean, it's not a problem, is what I mean. Now, the other claim that sometimes is made is that the Bible is a translation of a translation of a translation. And if you go to Google Translates, and you can play this game where you write a sentence in English and have it translated into one language, and then from that one translate it to another language, and blah, 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 and then eventually back to English, you'll get something that's not even recognizable. And so this claim that the Bible is a translation of a translation of a translation is a stumbling block to some people. But that's simply a myth. Almost all modern Bible translations were translated from the original languages. They're not translations of translations of translations. The New Testament was translated directly from these critical texts of the Greek New Testament. And the same thing is true of the Old Testament. Almost all of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. There are some chapters in Daniel, the middle chapters in Daniel, and I think some chapters in Ezekiel that are written in Aramaic. But everything else is written in Hebrew, and we can reconstruct that. Oh, and when it comes to looking at all these manuscripts, these ancient manuscripts, to compare them and find out what the original said, we don't have to just look at the Greek copies. We can also look at translations. It was translated into Syriac, Coptic. Coptic is the Egyptian language, but it's written in Greek letters. That's Coptic. So we have Coptic versions, and I think maybe Armenian. I can't remember what else. There's a lot of translations and stuff. And if you look at all the translations, there's like I think over 20,000 copies and stuff. And these translations can also help us what's that word I'm looking for? This is what I'm talking about with aphasia. This is a simple word that I'm looking for, and I can't think of it. And now I've lost my train of thought. What was I even talking about? Okay, so we got 20,000 or so copies and resolved. That's the word I was looking for. So we can look at these translations to resolve disputes and textual variants. So say you got two copies that date to around the same time, and one reads one way and another reads the other way. Well, if you've also got some translations, let's say one of these documents is missing a phrase or a sentence or something like that, and the other has the phrase or sentence, and you want to know if that phrase or sentence was in the original. Well, you can look at some of these translations, and you can tell from these translations whether the line was in there or not. So let's say that the line is in all of these translations. Well, these translations were translated from earlier copies, and so the fact that they're in these translations tells you that they were also in these earlier copies. And so you can resolve textual variants by looking at these translations too. Okay, so I think that's it. Let me talk a little bit about translations, because not all translations are equal. There are two kinds of, broadly speaking, there are two different ways of translating the Bible, there's what's called a dynamic equivalence, and there's called a formal translation. A formal, maybe it's just formal. There may be another word, I don't know. A dynamic equivalence is more of a loosely paraphrased translation, and a formal translation is where they try to go word to word as far as possible. That's not possible to do a perfect word-for-word translation from one language to another. For one thing, not every word has a corresponding word in a different language, and another thing, the grammar is going to be different. And so all translations have to do a little bit of paraphrasing. So it's just a matter of degree. And this distinction between formal translation and dynamic translations is not a tidy distinction. There's a range. And so some of the best formal translations include things like the NASB. I think the ESV is also a formal translation. One of the best dynamic equivalences is the NIV. There are other translations like the NRSV. That one I think is kind of based on the King James Version. I'm not really sure about that, but that's the one the scholars use. And it's not that the scholars depend on that translation. If you're a biblical scholar, part of the package there is that you know the original languages, so you're not dependent on these translations. But when they're doing their writings, they always cite the NRSV, and that's just a convention that they use. But the King James Version is also a formal translation. The difficulty with the King James Version, though, is that when the King James Version was written, there hadn't been a whole lot of textual criticism. Erasmus was one of the first textual critics, and he lived around the time of the Reformation. And then there was some other guy named Stephanos, and there was one other guy, his name I can't remember, Basil or something like that. I don't remember what his name was. But anyway, I think Erasmus only had 6 manuscripts to work with, and then there was a few additional ones with Stephanos and stuff. And by the time the King James Version came around, I'm not sure how many manuscripts there were, but it wasn't even 100. And now we've got, almost 6,000 of them. So we've got much better textual evidence now than we did back then. There are 2 major text families, and let me tell you about another kind of textual variant that there are. I meant to mention this earlier. I guess it doesn't really fit in this place in the video, but I'm doing these all off the top of my head, by the way, in case you haven't noticed that from other videos. I'm doing that so I can learn how to speak clearly and fluently without a aid. So one of the textual variants, or one of the ways that you can have textual variants, is like, say there's a passage that mentions Jesus. Well, you might have another copy of the same passage that says Jesus Christ, another one that says Lord Jesus, another that says Lord Jesus Christ, and one that might just say Christ or something like that. And so just titles and things like that. And so there are 2 text types that can be distinguished by that kind of variant. There's the Byzantine text type, and then there's the Alexandrian text type. And the Alexandrian text type is typically earlier than the Byzantine text type. The Byzantine text types are later, but there's a lot more of them. So there's sometimes disputes between textual critics about whether you should go with the majority text, which is going to lean more towards Byzantium, or the earlier text, which is going to lean more towards the Alexandrian. Well, most scholars seem to favor the Alexandrian text types, and that's part of the big dispute between King James onlyists and modern translations, because the King James Version is based primarily on the Byzantine text type. But anyway, I guess that's about all I wanted to say today. If I think of something, which is always possible, I can always add it while I'm in the middle of editing. So I think that's it for talking about the Bible as a source and talking about how we got our modern Bibles today. My personal favorite translation is the NASB. That's the one I use the most. The first time I read the Bible all the way through, I read it in the NIV. And I used to read the NIV a lot when I was a kid, or when I was a teenager and a young adult. And so a lot of the scriptures that I had memorized in my head just from reading it all the time are in the NIV. But for studying and everything, I prefer the NASB because the NASB is a little bit closer to a word-for-word translation. It's less loosely paraphrased. There are some bad translations or bad paraphrases, like the what's it called? I cannot remember, and therefore I'm not going to. Maybe I'll put a little thing on there. I'll look it up online. I'll put a little thing right there. There are some translations like the New World Translation. That's the one that the Jehovah's Witnesses put out, and that one you have to be kind of cautious about because it's a formal translation, which is a good thing. But the difficulty with it is it's a very biased translation. They translate it in a way to conform with their already existing theology. If you're a good exegete and you want to find out what the Bible means, you should try to get the meaning from the Bible, not impose the meaning onto the Bible. And so they have translated it in such a way as to conform with what they already believe. So that's not a good translation. Um, I only had one thing to add about biased translations. I guess any translation can be biased, but the advantage of the major translations like the NIV and the NASB and even the NRSV is the fact that it wasn't just one person that translated. There was a whole slew of people that contributed to that translation, and they're from a wide range of theological backgrounds. So but we don't have to be slaves to these translations because, I mean, just in the modern world, just sitting in front of your computer, you have access to all kinds of resources. So if you want to get back to what something says, you can look up the same passage in multiple translations on there's some web pages like I use Bible Gateway a lot. You can look up the same passage in multiple translations and compare them. You can also look up an interlinear where it has the Greek text, and then right below each Greek word it has like the English, so you can kind of figure out what was in the original. So and you can read commentaries. So there's all kinds of resources you have, so that you don't have to be a slave to one biased translation. But that's all I have to say. And so I guess that's about all I have to say.